Welcome back to BragWorthy Culture. This is your host, Jordan Peace. Today, we are fortunate to be with Brandon Sammut, who is the Chief People Officer at Zapier. If you don't know what Zapier is, get out from under the rock that you're under. But Zapier is on a mission to make automation incredibly easy and accessible to everyone at work. So what Zapier is the only no-code automation solution. They make it super easy to automate workflows and move data across something like 4,000 apps or more at this point. And obviously automation is essential and now achievable through Zapier. So wanted to throw that commercial out there because that is Zapier is something that we use a lot at Fringe. I'm a big fan. But Brandon, looking forward to getting to know you, and thank you so much for being here.
Hey, likewise, Jordan.
Awesome. Well, what I'd love to hear first is just a little bit more about Zapier, how the company has kind of been a pioneer both in its missional, direction of being this integration software, but also maybe even more relevantly to our podcast, how have you guys been a pioneer in terms of the remote workplace? Because from what I've read, you guys have been remote all along, correct?
That's right. 10 years and counting.
Wow, that's awesome. Tell us about that. I'd love to hear what that was like, building a remote culture right from the very beginning, way before it was cool, way before everybody was doing that. And then I'm sure there's a lot of lessons to be learned. And I'm sure you've had some other folks in your role from other organizations reach out to you and go, hey, you guys have been doing this a long time. Help me. I don't know what we're doing. But yeah, I would love to hear more about that, Brandon.
Absolutely. Well, to understand Zapier's talent and culture model, and particularly this 100% remote model, we'll start back in the early days. We'll actually start with Zapier's mission and product, because I think the two, the mission and product and the way we think about talent and working together, it all kind of hangs off of some core ideas. So if you dial all the way back to 2011, you've got, the three co-founders who are still running the company with our leadership team today, Wade, Mike, and Brian. And they're in college together. And they come up with the idea for Zapier while they are in school. When they graduate, after having worked on it for a while, they come out to the Bay Area and they do Y Combinator, one of the kind of classic startup accelerator programs.
Right.
During that time, they think about the mission of Zapier. And it's interesting, 10 years later, the mission of Zapier, some of the words have changed. We've come a little bit, tighter in how we talk about it. But the mission to make automation work for everyone was there at the very beginning. And the core idea was to take a powerful technology, which traditionally is either way too expensive or way too hard to use for ordinary people and businesses, and actually make it accessible in terms of both cost and usability. That was the core idea. It's still the core idea today. And so right in the DNA of Zapier's mission and product, you have some of these ideas around access and inclusion.
Right.
And also this idea that folks from all backgrounds, all over the world, all different industries, different levels of technical background or lack thereof, this notion that people are capable of amazing things. And importantly, that there are, even with all the technological advances we have seen, there is still a pretty broad swath of things that people do best. And how could we, by automating things, enable people to do more of the things that, breathe life into people, the things that people do best, the relationship work, the creative work, the in-person care and service work that is not only kind of, uniquely well done by people, but for a lot of folks, gives us a lot of energy, gives us a lot of purpose. Right. So you think about some of those core ideas embedded in the mission of the product: access, inclusion, purpose. Right. And then you think about talent strategy. Right. And Wade, Mike, and Brian, they went to school in the U.S. Midwest, in Missouri. A place where, I grew up in Michigan, not too far away, a place that a lot of tech companies kind of fly right over.
Right.
Right. You usually don't recruit talent directly out of that part of the U.S., at least traditionally. And even if you do, the next thing you ask folks to do when they sign the offer letter is pick up and move. right, to the Bay Area or New York or wherever, right?
Totally.
But you had to make a choice between your career and your community, typically. And I don't want to speak too much for Wade, Mike, and Brian, but I infer that they saw that dynamic and they wanted to do it differently. I infer that based on the mission of Zapier, they thought, brilliance is everywhere, and we want our company to have the ability to reflect that. And so from the very early days, all the way back in 2011, Zapier has been 100% remote. And like you said earlier, Jordan, that was at a time when a 100% remote company, it was actually more than just unconventional.
Right.
It was unwise, right? It was unwise. It was like bad idea. Like, don't do that.
Right. Yeah.
And they did it anyway. And I really admire the conviction. It's hard enough to do something like this when it's popular.
Mm-hmm.
You just imagine, the conviction you have to do it when it's, considered, not smart.
Totally.
As a 10 years later.
Yeah, I was just sorry to interrupt you. I was going to say, as a founder, you have to have an immense amount of conviction in your idea, right? To begin with. I mean, it takes so much conviction just to say, hey, the world needs this thing that we're creating. That is exhausting to sell that to the world, to the market, to the VCs, et cetera. And then on top of that, these guys go, hey, and we're going to do work completely differently than anyone else is doing it, while you tell us that it's unwise. It's just remarkable that's the pace of change in the world now. It takes 10 years for something to be unwise to be, and now completely obvious, and everyone is on board with it, right? It's hilarious how that transition takes place.
Absolutely. Well, and it's interesting to think about today, 10 years later, Zapier's gone from, the 3 founders who are still here today. We have just around 600 people. And because of that 100% remote model and this notion that, brilliance is everywhere. So let's be worthy of attracting talent from all over the world, because it's going to make us better. Those 600 people live in 39 countries.
Wow.
And we're better for it. It's just remarkable. It's one of the reasons why, I got really excited about coming to Zapier and working with this team on talent and culture.
Right.
Just can't think of another company of this size. We are not the biggest company in the world that is so well represented globally.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I love what you just said. I wasn't planning on pointing this out, but that phrase just jumped out at me, which was, let's be worthy of attracting talent. Like, I love how genuine that is, right? Because I think when a lot of companies think about attracting talent, it's a sales pitch. It's a marketing scheme. It's let's figure out a way to engineer an employer brand that will attract others to us, and the lack of understanding that you can't actually do that. An employer brand is based on who you actually are, because it's what people say about you. It can't be it's not something that you can just engineer. So I love that. Let's be worthy of attracting talent. That is about focusing on the company and its culture and genuinely wanting to do things the right way and letting that be attractive. That's beautifully put. So you spent 10 years doing this. I'm sure you guys have learned a whole lot of lessons. Tell me a little bit about the transition from, hey, we're recruiting people from a location and saying, hey, you can work from home, you can work from anywhere. And that was abnormal. That was like, that sounds great, but also weird. I don't know what to do. Should I set up an office at home? Like, I'm sure people had a lot more questions 5 and 10 years ago than they do now, where they're like, oh yeah, work from anywhere. I get it. This is familiar all of a sudden. Tell me about how you guys have changed and had to ideate and update those ideas around attracting talent 10 years ago versus the last 2 years.
Yeah, of course. It's a good question, Jordan. It's interesting. Sometimes folks ask, is Zapier still competitive on this particular note? Zapier, until very recently, was one of the only tech companies where you could work remote, kind of period. Right. And today, that's not true. There are many tech companies where you are allowed to work remote as an individual, where remote is certainly tolerated in some cases. But you know what's true, even after all of that conversation and all of that, kind of corporate soul searching, there are still only a handful of 100% remote tech companies of any reasonable size.
Right.
So this model, right, where everyone logs in on the same playing field every day, where you don't have to worry about the in-person lunch or hallway conversation you may have missed because you were working from home that day, or because you work from home, period, not in the HQ, right? I think that's still really distinctive. And starting to see some signal that folks are starting to really appreciate the difference between being allowed to work remote as a person and working at a 100% remote company. I also empathize, right? Zapier is very fortunate, and we don't forget that we're fortunate that we started this way. And it's once you start this way, there are all kinds of things you have to still figure out. We're always figuring out, like what's the next challenge with this model? Because the ways you implement a 100% remote model at 50 people looks different than 500, looks different than when we're at 1,500 over the next few years. And so this learner's posture, right? Like the same posture you want to apply to how you listen and learn from your customers or your prospective customers. Like we got to do that same thing internally, right? To make sure that this model like stays sharp and relevant and delivers the benefits, that we intend for it to have. I got a lot of empathy for most companies, right? It's if you started in a largely office-based model or even in a hybrid model, like this is challenging. I came from a company before Zapier that was in that model. That's more typical. And that's one of the reasons why I have so much empathy for that, because designing and maintaining hybrid models of work where some people are in the office, some people are from home sometimes, and some people are at home maybe all the time, I think that's actually massively more difficult than a pure play remote or pure play office. But the truth of the matter is there are very few pure play like singular office models in tech at any size, because even in a world where, say you're a company of 1,000 people and say 100% of those people work in offices, but in most cases, if you got to 1,000 people, you have multiple offices. And so you may not be remote, but you are distributed.
Absolutely.
Right. But no model is more difficult than the blended model where some are at home and some are in the office, at least in my mind.
Yeah, no, it's incredibly difficult. So one of the things that I noticed just from your website was this idea of a delocation package. And I'd imagine that comes from a time where people are coming from on location to moving, quote, off location because they're coming to work for you, right? That I'd imagine perhaps that's less relevant now because the folks that are coming in they're not necessarily void of a home office or some sort of setup like that anymore. So what's kind of the new thing, for Zapier in terms of programs and ways in which you're trying to support people moving in and through your organization?
Yeah, the delocation package is a great example of this learning loop, Jordan, because, in all humility, I'm not sure we're going to keep it. I'm not sure we're going to keep it for the reason that you mentioned. It was incredibly on point and relevant in the pre-pandemic world. For folks who were kind of already thinking about moving outside of the Bay Area after joining Zapier, it removes some of that friction. And then for the business, we got really talented people out of an unusually hot market where a lot of hiring was still being done. Bay Area tech companies still hiring a lot of people in the Bay Area, so it kind of repositioned some brilliant folks in a place they wanted to be anyway. We removed some friction to help them get there, but then also, you change your LinkedIn location in those days and you stop getting certain offers, right? Or invitations to interview at certain companies. And so there was a benefit to Zapier too. And it was also good for our people. Today, the landscape's really different. And a lot of these Bay Area tech companies are actively hiring folks from a variety of locations. And so, the kind of reason for being for that delocation program may be fading. And so it's like just one great example of how, pay attention. And this is true with external products too. Right. The, great product leaders that I follow, they talk as much about how do you know when to retire a product or a product line as how you know when to spin one up. right? It's that kind of pruning of your offerings that becomes super strategic. So good example there. And then to your second question, Jordan, around, well, okay, what's on the horizon, right? What's kind of something that's in development today at Zapier on talent and culture? And for that, we're talking about something we actually just shipped internally 2 weeks ago, and we're gonna publish more information about it in the weeks to come. And it's effectively a program whereby Zapier will help our people find their next job, whether it's at Zapier or somewhere else.
That's awesome.
Like a lot of companies, Zapier, has worked to help people find, growth and opportunity within the company for a while. But with this program, we're creating like clear pathways for that. But we're also creating a clear pathway where someone at Zapier can actually work with a member of our recruiting team to figure out whether this is still the right place for them, and if it's the right time for them to try something else, and actually help them figure that out. And recommend specific companies or roles, and get coaching on the resume or interviews. We can do mock interviews, you name it. And, the idea there is, it kind of comes back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago about this notion of Zapier being worthy. When we're at our best and we're worthy of our people being at Zapier for as long as it's right for them, we're doing everything within our influence to be the right place. And if we are doing that, and despite all of that, it's the right thing for someone to go somewhere else, we should thank them for the time they spent here and do what we reasonably can to help them find a great next job. Full stop. And so it's one of those things where, like, in the conventional way of thinking, it's like, well, why would you do that? You're actually removing friction for folks leaving. But the truth is, like, if we're doing all the right stuff that's within our control and someone's still going to leave, like, it's probably the right thing. And why would we try to, twist someone's arm to stay? Now, on the flip side, we're also paying attention, right, and listening and learning about the things that are within our influence, where someone would leave and it's actually regrettable, right? We're like, oh gosh, if we had thought about that differently, or if we had communicated that better, or if we had had that growth conversation earlier, it might have actually influenced or changed that person's point of view about whether Zapier could be right for them for another tour of duty. So we're not perfect on that. So we're still working on all of that. But in addition, this program feels absolutely right. To show up for our people. Our people contribute so much to us, and this is another way we can do that for them.
I love it. It's, again, such an authentic acknowledgement of what's best for people, right? And not presuming that staying with your company till the end of time is what's best, right? And so not only are you honoring, I think, their journey and their own wisdom as to what's best for them, but you're also creating advocates out there in the world that, were employees and left really well, were helped to leave and helped to continue along their journey, and will speak really well of Zapier, for years and years. And maybe bring partnerships and bring out tell other folks to go and apply, and so forth. So it's a strategic move, but it's also just one that's just very honoring of the human journey and just very, I don't know, it shows a lot of genuine care for your people, your Zapians, as you guys put it, which I love. I love that. So maybe a little bit of an obvious question, so forgive me, but you guys have built a remote culture for 10 years. Right. There hasn't really been, I would imagine, like that culture shock that everyone else has experienced of, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? The hybrid model, we're freaking out. So I would imagine if I'm listening to this podcast and I'm in a position similar to yours, I'm thinking, man, this guy has a lot to teach about how to build culture remotely. And since you also have been in a fully officed environment prior, you get the contrast as well. So, again, I get that it's still unique to be fully remote. And I get that your advice may not be perfectly applicable to the hybrid model, but in your context, what are the special ways in which you've had to go about building culture, knowing that there are no water cooler conversations that are happening organically?
Mm-hmm. Here's what I would say on this. I think there are challenges to creating belonging and building culture in an all remote environment. But as you figure it out, I actually think where you land is stronger and more inclusive. Because in some of the worlds I've operated in the past, culture is being created, and some people may feel deep bonds and deep affiliations with people and with the company. Maybe it's because they're in the headquarters, or they get to see the CEO, they get to see her in the
Right.
hallway, every day or something like that, and you get to sit at the lunch table with with their leader's leader. And so for that individual,
Mm-hmm.
like that's really powerful and fairly organic. But if you talk to most companies of any reasonable size, like, you also hear stories of folks who feel, unaffiliated or detached from that. Maybe it's because they work from home, or maybe it's because they're on a team that's going through a lot of change, or maybe it's because they just sit on the wrong side of the office, or there's less foot
Yeah.
traffic, or, whatever the case may be. And so I think there's some initial hurdles to go over when you're remote, because less of that just organic
Right.
stuff happens, to put really simply. But as you figure it out, you're typically solving for the whole company at that point, and the things you do to figure out culture and connection and belonging for all remote company typically work for the whole company,
Right.
right? Or have the potential to work for the whole company in a way that kind of the more accidental or organic modes don't always deliver. So there's more upfront work and challenge, but the output, I think, can work for more and more people. Specifically, if I could point to one specific practice at Zapier that, even having studied it and read about it before I joined the company, has really stuck with me, seeing it in practice, is transparency. It's transparency. In fact, it's so core to how Zapier and Zapier culture works that it's one of the 5 Zapier values. Default to transparency is how we call it. And I think this is part of the model, especially
Right.
for 100% remote. You have folks logging in not just from 39 different countries, but many places
Right.
within each country. And it's not only different locations,
Mm-hmm.
it's different time zones. The Zapier as a company is not awake at any specific. You can pick any day on your local clock, right? And like you can't, like, there was a portion of the company that was not online. And on top of that, right, like we know, like all leadership teams know, that having access to information and context is part of how people understand how they develop
Right.
focus and purpose in their job. It's part of how you develop a sense of belonging with your team. It's also, practically speaking, like how you figure out how to be great at your job, which is really important to folks, understandably. So for all of these reasons, like transparency, like this is where so much of the action is. If you give people, access to the context and the relationships and the histories, of how the place works and what have you, and you do that in a way that can be pulled down in different modes based on how people learn, different time zones based on where people live, and so on. That's a rare and special thing. And wherever we can at Zapier, we're also thinking about how to automate that.
Yeah. Right. Naturally.
given
That's kind of what you guys do.
mission,
Yeah.
right? So it's kind of our thing. What's so interesting after all of these years, like, when I sit down and talk with teammates, there's so many green fields ahead. We may be 10 years into 100% remote work, but it still feels like early days for us. And I think as long as we stay curious, the sky's the limit for how you scale this culture. Because, like we talked about earlier, doing remote with 50 people is different than 500,
Totally.
different than 1,500. And so, like, we've got to stay humble. We've got to stay curious. And, the fact that more and more organizations are thinking about this, like, we feel like we have this, like, a whole new community, right, that we get to tap
That's
into
true.
now and learn from.
Or teach. Because I'd imagine you guys have you don't have all the answers, and you need to stay curious and humble, obviously, but you got a lot more answers, I would guess, than most, just given all the experience you've had over the years. So I'm sure there are folks that are going to reach out to you after hearing this and go, teach me how to do this. Because it's not easy. And you mentioned having empathy for those folks, but it's really not easy to go from an office environment to remote or blended or anything else. I have so many questions I want to ask you. We might have to kind of reconvene at some point and have another episode. But for the moment, just to kind of wrap us up, our listenership is a lot of folks either at your level or below, but typically they're people in the people strategy world, in the HR space, and the whatever you want to call it. I prefer the people strategy titles. But I think one thing that's been talked about a lot lately, and I saw Josh Burson come out with a big article about this, is employer brand, and this notion that, and we touched on it a little bit already, but there's the consumer brand, right? Hey, how do we look and sound and feel to our consumer, our buyer? Then there's the employer brand. That's, what do people think it might be like to work here based on what our people say about us, both present and past employees. So in building up that employer brand, if I'm a young company, how do I think about doing that so that I can be prepared to scale? So that when that big check comes in and we're going to go from 50 people to 150 people, I can attract who I want to attract and be able to move, right, without this giant hindrance to the company of kind of fighting for interviews.
Well, the topic of talent brand, like a lot of things, like the first question you ask kind of informs everything that happens after that point. And it's how you create your focus. And so the question ends up being pretty deterministic. And, it's really natural in talent branding efforts to start by asking, like, what should we say? Like, what do we want to convey? What do we want to say to our audiences, whether it's prospective candidates, most often in this case? There's a different spin on that question that I think is maybe even more well pointed in a useful direction, which is it's less what should we say and more what should we show. What should we show gets us thinking about like what's already going on here. So it's less the work of like coming up with stuff and more the work of like how do we externalize the things that are already true in a way that's like accessible and engaging for this audience, right? So like, what should we show? And the great thing about that is that if you ask that question, your talent brand ends up being like so much more naturally and strongly attached to your mission, and so much more strongly aligned with like what is actually going on at the company. Because no company is perfect, and no company is right for everybody. And so just like great customer-facing brands, great employer brands are distinctive. They help people decide whether it's right for me. I can't think of a company on the planet that's hiring so much that they have to be the right thing for not even everyone, but even most anyone of a particular skill type or profile, right? We need to help people decide. Which, by the way, has all kinds of other benefits, right? Like if you do a great job within talent branding because you're showing, not telling, and you just this is who we are, this is what we're about. And the people who apply to your company, right? And by the way, if you're conveying that effectively so that people are engaging with that content before they apply, like think of the power in that. Like how does that change the kind of just like in like moment zero degree of alignment that you have with your candidates, and how does that enable, how does that grow the kind of effectiveness of your hiring? So there are, it's also pre-onboarding, by the way. Like great talent branding is great. It's great for self-selection for candidates. It like refines your funnel. It's great for selection, but it also is a form of pre-onboarding as well when it's done really well. Zapier makes no claims to be doing it at that level, but that is our point of view on how we are going to go about the next phase of our talent branding work.
I love it. Yeah, you really crystallized something in my mind. I always say you can't fake your employer brand or your talent brand. Like you can't fake it. It just is what it is. But I guess in theory, you could fake it, right? You could come up with the what should we say answer, and you could market yourself to people. But then when they get in and they see what you actually are, if it doesn't match up to what you said, because you said instead of showed, right? Then there's this, first of all, it's disingenuous. But second of all, there's this misalignment and this potentially mistrust that builds immediately. Like, hey, this isn't the place that I was told it was, because I was sold instead of shown. Right. So I think it's a beautiful thing. It's not only more genuine to do it that way, but it's also, you're going to keep your people longer. You're going to have people aligned with your mission organically. And you're going to hire who you actually want, as opposed to someone that just maybe has the resume, but they aren't actually a good cultural fit because they didn't know what your culture was because you marketed to them. So I think that's awesome. So show instead of tell. What should we show? So just trying to summarize that for our listeners. Brandon, I wish we had like 2 more hours. I'm really enjoying this. And I might, if it's okay, I may ask you to come back and talk to me some more, or maybe even just talk to me offline. And I could get some tips personally, but really enjoyed it. Any final thoughts, anything that you had wished that I had asked you that I failed to ask you today?
The parting thought would be this, for my fellow people out there, it's just, there's a talent renaissance going on right now. It's also really challenging, right? Like a lot of renaissance, a lot of growth, a lot of change, and a lot of uncertainty. And so I just, again, like tons of empathy and respect for everyone doing this work, organizations of all types and sizes, and, be gentle with yourselves. There's a ton of opportunity on the other side of this if we take care of ourselves and stick in it for the long run.
That's great. That's great. End it with empathy. Brandon, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. I really enjoyed listening to you, and I really appreciate your time.
It was a pleasure, Jordan. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for listening to the BragWorthy Culture. We will catch you soon. Bye-bye.